So we made it to part 4, which is called the good fight. And so in this part, Obama's going to be fighting the good fight of protecting the world from the economic crisis. And so he says, so he's at an international conference and he's talking about Lula da Silva, who's the president of Brazil. And he said, or the former president, he says he also reportedly had the scruples of a Tammany Hall boss, and rumors swirled about government cronyism, sweetheart deals, and kickbacks that ran into the billions. So he says a couple nice things about Lula, then he says he's a crony and he has, billions of dollars in kickbacks and sweetheart deals. That's kind of interesting because Obama, it's true that there was some allegations of corruption within PT, or the Workers' Party in Brazil under Lula, but that level of corruption was like the least corrupt government in the history of Brazil, because the amount of corruption and cronyism in Brazil is even higher than in the U.S. due to the legacy of colonialism and how high the wealth inequality is there. But outside of that Obama is able to criticize him when Obama literally packed his administration with people from Wall Street that worked on Wall Street, then worked in his administration, literally writing legislation that helped give Wall Street hundreds of billions of dollars and not hold any of them accountable. And then those same people go back to Wall Street, which Obama also does to give speeches for, right afterwards. That's not cronyism. That's just what everybody does in the U.S. And so Obama is going to hold himself up as some squeaky clean, embodiment of anti-corruption, when in reality, he's one of the most corrupt people. It's just that everybody's corrupt, and he's the top of that corrupt system. And Lula was not that corrupt. In fact, the Javalato, the car wash investigations, which were running in Brazil, which ended up leading to the fall of Dilma Rousseff, who was Lula's successor, and the fall of PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, and as well as the imprisonment of Lula for corruption in the early, or I don't know when it was, probably in 2017 or 2016 or something like that, which is probably when Obama was writing this book, is because the view was that, look, Lula's in prison for corruption, therefore he's corrupt, therefore I can call him corrupt. That was totally undermined by the Intercept reporting in Brazil, and it was shown that the head of that investigation was working with the head judge in that investigation, Sergio Moro, who ended up being one of the top justice ministers in the Bolsonaro government, which benefited from having Lula imprisoned, because Lula was going to run against him, and he was way up in the polls, because when Lula left office, he had an 80% approval rating. He was the most popular politician in the world at that point. And he was actually a genuine reformer that actually did real things. He didn't do as much as I thought he would do, but he legitimately reduced poverty rates and worked to grow Brazil and take on the established interests that had been dominating the country. And Obama didn't like him for a number of reasons I'll mention later. Maybe because Lula was actually running on the same platform as Obama, but he didn't really sell out. He didn't accommodate himself to establishment like Obama did, and so Obama will go after him as being corrupt here. But Bolsonaro put him in prison for the corruption charges. It was then shown that the judge was literally texting the prosecution, telling them what arguments to make in order to do that. And then that judge, which put Lula in prison, which allowed Bolsonaro to become president, then gets appointed as the head justice minister for Bolsonaro. So that's a level of corruption that you could hardly even imagine. Judge working with prosecution to imprison political opponent for nothing, who was the most popular in the country, in order for this president to become president and then appoint that judge as the top minister. Doesn't get any more corrupt than that. That's what happened to Lula. That's not something that he's going to mention in this book, and I don't think he's going to mention it in his next book either. Instead, it's better for him to call Lula corrupt, when in reality he was the least corrupt and not even anywhere close to as corrupt as Obama was. But he did embody some actual populist reforms, which I think Obama is bitter about, because he accommodated himself to Wall Street and to the business classes at every turn, and so therefore he has to throw some stones at Lula. I know this video is way too long. I know nobody's listening to me, but I can't just read over these paragraphs without commenting on them, and so it's gonna just keep getting longer. He says, he's at an international conference, he's talking about America's high-minded idealism compared to these other self-interested countries. And so he says that Few nations felt obliged to act beyond narrow self-interest, and those that shared America's basic commitment to the principles upon which a liberal market-based system depended: individual freedom, the rule of law, which I just talked about, he's undermining all the time. The U.S. does not follow international law and follows it to a lesser degree than most developed countries do, because, again, we control the system so we don't have to follow the law, but it's still helpful to say that we support the rule of law, because then we can be the high-minded people that have higher intentions, and so therefore we should export those to the rest of the world and use that as an excuse to continue the economic system and our militarism, and then we deny the rule of law in order to do so. That is the circle that he's supporting there. Strong enforcement of property rights. Yes, that's an important thing for the U.S. for sure, because who owns the property? The corporations own the property because they own all the wealth, and the rich people own all the wealth, and rich people own the government. And so enforcing property rights is very important. So if people in Iran want to undermine the international system of property rights by saying that these multinational corporations that struck sweetheart deals with autocrats a century ago should not be able to extract all the wealth out of Iran and Guatemala and Chile and the many other countries which we've overthrown and invaded, that's not good, because the international system is based on supporting property rights. And so land reforms in Brazil under Lula and PT and the movements in Brazil, I forget what it was called, but the land reform movements, which was the largest in the country or in the world at that time, those are things that undermine the economic system. And so, and he says strong enforcement of property rights and neutral arbitration of disputes. Neutral arbitration is ridiculous. In some of the trade deals that Obama was pushing, I think certainly in NAFTA, but also in the TPP as well, there are provisions in there that corporations can sue governments for actions that would cost potential future profits. So if a country wants to enforce environmental laws that might stop an oil company from polluting a waterway, that oil company can then go to these neutral arbitrators of disputes and then sue the country and the people of that country for the loss of future profits. And so this is the international system. Plus baseline levels of government accountability and competence. Yeah, right. Okay, whatever. Lack the economic and political heft, not to mention the army of diplomats and policy experts to promote these principles on a global scale. And then he says that these other countries, they don't have the ideals like us that I just laid out. So he says China, Russia, and even genuine democracies like Brazil, India, and South Africa still operate on different principles. For BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and what is the S? I forget what S is. I forget, South Africa. Responsible foreign policy meant tending to one's own affairs. They abided by established rules only insofar as their own interests were advanced, out of necessity rather than conviction. Unlike the U.S., we just out of necessity follow international law. When we're invading Iraq, we are out of necessity following international law. When we're torturing people, when we're passing all these trade deals and overthrowing governments, we are out of necessity following international law, unlike these other self-interested countries. It's weird, because you think that a state, they're similar institutions globally, they have similar populations, they have similar domestic interests and pressures, they would probably respond to the same things. But no, as it turns out, the people in the U.S. are so much better than the people of other countries, that the way that our state works is that we do it out, we abide by established rules out of necessity, just because we're different as a people. And these other countries, they're just not as high-minded, and so they just have totally different interests, and because their people aren't as good. That's the only way that you could explain this if you're taking this approach. If you look at it on a systemic level or on a case-by-case basis, it's clear that the U.S. does exactly what other countries do, and even to a greater extent, because the U.S. has greater power. But then all countries will rebrand themselves as the best country, because that's in every country's interest, and Obama's just the one that is acting as the rebrander right now. He says these nations certainly felt no obligation to underwrite the system as a whole, maybe because they're not benefiting from it as a whole in the same way that the U.S. is. As far as they were concerned, that was a luxury only a fat and happy West could afford. The poor, fat and happy West has to underwrite this whole system for all these poor countries that don't have high-minded ideals like us. And so then Obama starts talking about his negotiations with the Russians, and he's because he's a tough guy, if you're a tough president, you have to negotiate with the Russians, and so he's got to put that in his book. And he says that, let's see, I was most interested in engaging with Medvedev. The U.S. relationship with Russia was at a particular low point. The previous summer, a few months after Medvedev had been sworn into office, Russia had invaded the neighboring country of Georgia. And so he's like, this is unacceptable. They just invaded Georgia, and we need to tell them not to do invasions of other countries. Do you know the thing I'm going to say about the U.S. invading all these other countries, including under Obama, and continuing those occupations? You'd think that that would maybe lose some credentials for you to lecture other countries about invading other countries. It doesn't for the U.S. because, again, we can do whatever we want to because we control the world, and then we complain about having to deal with the global system that we set up for our own benefit. The previous paragraph, as Obama did, if other countries like Russia invade countries that are within their right next to them that used to be Soviet bloc members, or that even like a large amount of the population wants to go back to the Soviet Union, as in the case of Crimea, which has a long history of being part of Russia, and then also was used twice to invade and destroy Russia by Hitler, as well as during the First World War as well. So there's strong interest in Russia having influence right next to it, especially as NATO creeps further and further to the east, including during the Obama administration, when in theory the Soviet Union is already gone. Why are they expanding this hostile military alliance right up to our borders? And so Russia invaded this other country. Still wasn't the right thing to do, but like that Obama thinks that you can lecture other countries about that when he's the one that's presiding over the U.S. occupation of a bunch of countries around the world and hundreds of U.S. bases, and expanding the war in Afghanistan and droning people in 7 different countries. It's kind of unbelievable. It might sound like I'm ragging on Obama all the time, but there's plenty of times where, not plenty of times, there are times throughout this book where I'm reminded that Obama oftentimes was attacked from the right, from the Republican Party and the media, in a way that was totally ridiculous and says a lot about the political culture in which Obama accommodated himself to. But like right here, he's talking about how he's at the international conference, and he's like, 2 days later, a reporter would follow up on this, asking my views on American exceptionalism. He says, I believe in American exceptionalism, I said, just as I suspect the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and that the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. Is that like a controversial statement? Like, do people not understand that other countries have the same type of nationalistic myths about their country and why they are superior and why they need to support their sports teams and have solidarity with their countrymen that the U.S. has? Like, this is what nationalism is. It's also a reason that the belief in American, like that Obama says that and then is like, oh yeah, no, I believe in it. I understand how ridiculous it is and how it's based on geography, and that is pretty much arbitrary. But I believe in it because he has to believe in it because he's the head of the American empire. But at least he couches it in a recognition that this is not unique. It's just kind of nationalistic and tribalism expanded to hundreds of millions of people and a global economic order over which he presides. But then, like he says, 1 week later, I would learn that the Republicans and conservative news outlets had seized upon this unremarkable statement, one made in an effort to show modesty and good manners, as evidence of weakness and insufficient patriotism on my part. Yeah, that's true. There's 100 different ridiculous things. Pretty much there's a ton of attacks of Obama online. Most of them are from the right wing, and most of them are totally ridiculous and off the wall. And so, as you read this 10-hour or listen to this 10-hour critique of me browbeating Obama about all the terrible things that he did and the things that he didn't do, which he could have done, just remember there's no way I would ever vote for any of these Republicans that are totally insane, especially with their critiques for Obama, the few times that he does do things that are marginally okay or even good. Page 345 is interesting because Obama starts talking about Europe's reluctance to support American militarism after what the British has done, and how that's making it difficult for the governments of Europe to supply troops and resources towards NATO, which is again a military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with the U.S. at the head of it, and European kind of junior partners, meant to upkeep the global international order with an emphasis on Europe. And they're having trouble convincing or getting the political will to continue support for NATO because the populations of Europe are not supportive of it anymore because the Bush administration invaded Iraq, which was not popular at all by anybody. They were kind of scuttling international law and international norms, and were kind of a global pariah. And so that put these governments in a difficult position because they want to continue to help the U.S. because, again, they're tied to the same kind of global interests that have led to the world order as it now stands. But at the same time, they have domestic political pressures, which they have to take into account also if they want to get elected. And so they're like, it's going to be tough for us. We want to do it, but it's going to be tough. That's actually one of the main reasons that Obama got a lot of support from generals and from the military establishment and from the establishment in general, especially of the Democratic Party, and the donor class. Like, he got more donations from Wall Street. Like, he wasn't viewed as an outsider from them. One, because he branded himself well, but also because the military understood that the Obama administration represented an opportunity to kind of hit the reset button. And here we had this fresh, young face, like an outsider, hope and change, wants to, do things differently for the public, and he's viewed differently by the U.S. population as well as by the global population. There's one point where Obama's talking about doing a speech in, I think, Berlin or somewhere in Germany, and he's getting like 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of people to come out to speak, and here in Germany, Bush wouldn't get that. You might get tens of thousands of protesters. John McCain wouldn't get that, but Obama would get that because, again, he was a rebranded kind of changey candidate, but he didn't threaten anything fundamental. And so in that way, I'll put the link to there was a leak early on or late in the Obama campaign in 2008, where the Defense Department, I think it was, talked about how important it would be for Obama to win so that support for the military domestically didn't start to get undermined by the terrible actions of the Bush administration, which were unpopular, and how Obama could rebrand that. Well, that same dynamic is being talked about right here. And so one of the negatives of having a fresh, young, intelligent, polished, outsider-y kind of vibe politician as the head of the American empire is that it gets the left to shut up, and it gets the anti-war movement to shut up, and it gets the populations domestically as well as internationally to kind of have more support for the American militarism, which has been long-standing but was just not done very efficiently or well during the Bush administration, and so needed a rebrand. So Obama starts talking about how important it is to work with Turkey, and how they, him and Erdogan had a close working relationship on a number of issues, even though we didn't see eye to eye on everything, and Obama was skeptical of his commitments to democracy, and he thought he might have some autocratic tendencies, which of course is a good thing to know in retrospect, because going forward, he actually did become more of a dictator. And Obama knew he would the whole time, and he put it in this book, but he didn't talk about it, and instead worked closely with him. Because again, it's not a problem for people to be autocrats. It's a problem if they're autocrats and they're not aligned with U.S. interests, as the discussion about the Arab Spring in a couple hundred pages is going to demonstrate. But in terms of Turkey, he talks about the relationship. He says, Turkey looked to the United States for support of its EU bid, which of course Turkey never got, in my view, because Europe had no intention of allowing Turkey into the EU, because despite all the, the identical houses and the lovely, communities and surface when you go to Europe, there still are a lot of dark forces kind of under the curtain there, which were aroused just 70 years earlier, and I don't think they were going to ever let in. I don't think they ever wanted to let in a majority Muslim country into the European Union, even as a bridge to the Muslim world. Just look at what happened when the Libyan immigrants tried to come to Europe. Immediately, far-right backlash, and every country, closes up its borders in the same way that Trump would have, the U.S. do with the Muslim ban. Even in Germany, where I'm half kind of from, Merkel and the Conservative Party said that they wanted to let some of them in, and immediately her own party within it, there was a backlash, and then also a backlash in the far right, and so now the Alternative for Deutschland has like the highest, which is a far right party, not quite a neo-Nazi party, but it's not good, but they have the highest amount of seats that any far right party has had since World War II, and the same trend is going all throughout Europe, in Hungary, in Poland. There's a big far-right backlash in France. Le Pen almost won. There's a big far-right backlash against the kind of establishment powers for a lot of reasons, but part of it is xenophobia. And so the idea that they were going to allow Turkey in 6 years before all this kind of started to happen was not really in the cards. And I think that's one thing that Erdogan realized, and he was like, okay, this liberalization that the EU keeps demanding as a prerequisite for being allowed into the European Union is just a charade, because they keep moving the goalposts as we hit their standards. But that's kind of just a tangent. But he says, as well as military and intelligence assistance in fighting Kurdish separatists. This is what Turkey wants from the U.S. Assistance in fighting Kurdish separatists who'd been emboldened by the fall of Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, we needed Turkey's cooperation to combat terrorism and stabilize Iraq. And so the way Obama's portraying it is that Turkey just needed help fighting these Kurdish separatists, and we needed help in fighting terrorism. This is funny because, like, 4 years later, ISIS starts, or around 4 years later, ISIS begins. And the biggest group fighting ISIS was the PKK, or the Kurdish Workers' Party, or they were one of the main groups on the ground actually fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And the PKK is a group that the Turkish government has on the defines as terrorists, and used U.S. missiles and bombs to bomb. So pretty much Obama's saying that they just need our help fighting the PKK, and we need their help fighting terrorists. PKK is actually fighting terrorists, and they're extremely liberal, and like in terms of like sectarian groups on the ground there, like they're as good as you can get in that region by a long shot, actually, and they have a lot of individual liberties for people, and they're fighting for the values that the U.S. claims to have as their top priority in terms of democracy and human rights against ISIS. So you think that would be a top priority. Instead, the U.S. supports Turkey in order to allow Turkey to bomb the PKK and try to destroy the PKK, which they define as terrorists, when the PKK was fighting ISIS. So it makes you think that whatever the U.S. foreign policy is, it's incoherent if you were to take Obama's, words here at face value. And so then Obama goes to Prague to meet with the president of the Czech Republic, and they talk about a bunch of different diplomatic stuff. And then at some point, he goes out of the way to make sure he had a chance to meet with Václav Havel, who was a playwright and former dissident who had been the president of the Czech Republic for 2-year terms, finishing in 2003. A participant in the Prague Spring, he'd been blacklisted after the Soviet occupation, had his work banned, and had been repeatedly jailed for his political activities. And so he's like the most well-known dissident, one of the most well-known dissidents in Eastern Europe during the 1980s. And everybody in the U.S. talks about Václav Havel all the time in terms of when they talk about, look at what the Soviet Union was doing over here, and look at these brave Eastern Europeans standing up to it. What he did was brave, but what's actually more revealing is what he didn't do and who they don't talk about as dissidents during that same time. And so during, I think it was 1989 or so, Václav Havel came to the U.S. to give a speech to a joint session of Congress, which is extremely rare. I think that's only happened like 10 times or something, that the Senate and the House come to hear a speaker from outside the country. All the press talked about it. There was, after the speech which he condemned the Soviet Union, everybody, was totally on his side and being like, look at this magnificent person standing up for human rights. Well, at the same time, there was oppression in Eastern Europe going on through the Soviet Union. But then at the same time, there was much larger repression and violence and massacres happening in South America and Central America, at the hands of the U.S. through the Reagan administration. And none of that was covered at all. And so by coincidence, I think it was like a month or so afterwards, or before his speech about the importance of supporting human rights and dissidents around the world to Congress, where he exclusively talked about the Soviet Union as the orchestrator of violence and human rights abuses. The U.S. had just supported or trained a bunch of assassins to go kill 6 Jesuit priests in, I think it was El Salvador, who were the leaders of liberation theology in South America and Central America, that were trying to get the U.S. and U.S. corporations from controlling the politics of the Americas, which they've been doing for the better part of a century since the Monroe Doctrine. And the U.S. was running an underground war through the CIA, through a bunch of intermediaries, to kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and then also in Guatemala. And that was on a scale much larger than what was happening in Eastern Europe, but nobody talked about it. But you'd think if the world's like number one leading dissident was in the U.S., that would be something that he brings up. he did not bring it up, and instead he played the card. The reason that he got so much press, and that and that Obama will put him in his book here, and that he's talking to a joint session of Congress, is because he's able to paint the Soviet Union as the big bad wolf, and they are one of the big bad wolves. And at the same time, in doing so, he's like, "Thank you, U.S., your beacon of hope, democracy, freedom, human rights. Like, this is why I love. Like, you support dissidents, we don't." That's the perfect message for the State Department and for the kind of power centers in the U.S. to use this propaganda to bludgeon the Soviet Union over the head with. But if you were to talk about what the U.S. does, then that would undermine that message severely, and he wouldn't be talked about, and he would be treated in the same way as other dissidents around the world who are just ignored. Or in the case of those Jesuit priests who were the leaders of that movement, which was a mass movement of millions of people in South and Central America, which people probably have no idea what I'm talking about right now, but you can look it up, and I'll put some references on the screen, I guess. They'll just be, gunned down in I think it was in church. So I think that's kind of revealing. Obama starts talking about the nuclear weapons issue, which is his top issue. So he says, like, I had one big speech on the trip to lay out a top foreign policy initiative, the reduction and ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons. So that's his top foreign policy initiative, which I believe he's sincere about that, but it's just that the way he went about it was like, how do I reduce nuclear weapons without alienating any constituencies or any of the entrenched interests, which got us to the point that there are tens of thousands of nuclear weapons around the world, including principally by the U.S., which has the biggest military, which I don't want to confront. And if Ben and Jerry has asked me to commit to slightly reducing the size of, I'm going to tell them, sorry, special interest ice cream man, not today, but I want to reduce all the nuclear weapons. Well, within that framework, it's going to be limited success. And so I won't run through all the things here, but he's like, oh, this is what I said to this country's leader, and this I said to that, and this is how I balanced this interest with that interest, and it was a balancing act. But, since I'm such a skilled diplomat and a force for change, this is what I did. He did slightly reduce the risk of nuclear war with the Iran deal, and maybe he did a couple other steps, but like fundamentally the same exact dynamics are there. Like, I just got back, I was in Great Falls, Montana, which is like a medium-sized town of, I don't know, maybe 50,000 people in the middle of nowhere in Montana, and there's like a military base there, and there are I forget exactly how many. I don't know with the exact number, but there are like hundreds of nuclear warheads, or at least dozens. I think hundreds of nuclear warheads in Great Falls, Montana. And and that's only a couple hundred of the around 7,000 or so nuclear warheads that the U.S. currently has. And it's like, if the number of nuclear weapons in Great Falls, Montana, not to mention the dozens or hundreds of other places and submarines that just the U.S. has, any one of those places could destroy the world. If you have 60 nuclear weapons, or if you have 100 nuclear weapons, that's plenty enough nuclear weapons to do as much damage as you could possibly imagine. Maybe cause a nuclear winter, maybe cause the Holocaust, or not a Holocaust, but the apocalypse. Whatever it is. And it's like that dynamic was not really changed by Obama, despite his being his top foreign policy initiative. It's not because he didn't, he wasn't quite crafty enough in trying to deal within the system. It's because he didn't want to confront the system. Obama starts talking about the Velvet Revolution and the fall of the Soviet Union, and just revolutions in general, and at just how wholesome and nourishing they are to his soul as a idealistic revolutionary that just happens to be the president now. And so he's like, I had been in law school in 1989. I recalled sitting alone in my basement apartment a few miles from Harvard Square, glued to my secondhand TV set as I watched what would become known as the Velvet Revolution unfold. I remember being riveted by those protests and hugely inspired. It was the same feeling I'd had earlier in the year, seeing the solitary figure facing down tanks in Tiananmen Square. The same inspiration I felt whenever I watched grainy footage of freedom riders or John Lewis and his fellow civil rights soldiers marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. To ordinary people sloughing off fear and habit to act on their deepest beliefs, to see young people risking everything just to have a say in their own lives, to strip the world. It goes on. And so, this is what Obama lives for. Compare this. Just remember, put a pin in this, and then if you're still here in 2 hours when I get to the Arab Spring, then remember this, because in that chapter he goes around pontificating about, oh yeah, no, I feel like I'm on your side, but I kind of can't really be on your side because like we support these leaders, and now that I'm actually in a position as the most powerful person on earth to make a difference in these things, I'm going to stand directly. I'm going to be the tank that's going after the man at Tiananmen Square, but I don't want to be. And so the start of chapter 15, Obama just saved not Captain Sullenberger. What was his name? He saved the captain from, he saved Tom Hanks from the pirates, and he had the Navy SEALs assassinate them. And then he kind of goes on a long diatribe about, like, I didn't want to kill these poor boys, but, he says, but I also realized that around the world, in places like Yemen and Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iraq, the lives of millions of young men like these 3 dead Somalis had been warped and stunted by desperation, ignorance, dreams of religious glory, and the violence of their surroundings or the schemes of older men. They were dangerous, these young men, often deliberately and callously cruel. Still, in the aggregate, at least, I wanted somehow to save them. Send them to school, give them a trade, drain them of the hate that had been filling their heads. And yet the world that they were a part of and the machinery I commanded, more often than not, had me killing them instead. Whew, that's powerful. So he's, ahead, like he says, the world that they were a part of and the machinery I commanded more often had me killing them instead. So he's like, I'm the head of the machinery that's killing them, but I wish that I could do something about it. This is the gaslighting of somebody that easily could do something about it if he had principles, explaining why he's not doing something about it, and at the same time trying to get credit for realizing that he should be doing something about it. Like, I remember there's a Louis C.K. joke where he's talking about being in the airplane and like having a soldier pass him by, and he like thinking to himself, like, I should really give that guy my seat. He's like, that would be a really good thing for me to do. He's like, I'm not gonna do it, but like I'm gonna enjoy this thought about me potentially doing that. So this Obama, like, yeah, I'd like to not be killing all these people as the head of the American empire, but here I am. But do I get credit for like not wanting to? No, you don't get credit for it, Obama. Well, actually, you do get credit for it for most people, but you shouldn't get credit. Next page, Obama continues. He's talking about all being the head of the empire. He says, I took no joy in any of this. It didn't make me feel powerful. I had entered politics to help kids get a better education.
How do I reach these kids?
Help families get health care, to help poor countries grow more food. It was the kind of power that I measured myself against. So he doesn't like it. He doesn't like that he's spending all the resources that could be going towards giving people education or health care or food to blowing up people as he expands the drone war and justifies all of this and rebrands everything. He doesn't like it, but he's doing it anyways. So then Obama starts talking about the Bush administration and kind of rebranding the Bush administration's counterterrorism programs and the war on terror as, things that were maybe misguided or over the top, and I didn't agree with this, and I didn't think the invasion of Iraq was that good, and like maybe Abu Ghraib was kind of bad. But overall, like, we have to give him credit, and I don't question his motives at all. Because again, Obama's like, he's a president now. You can't question other presidents if you're a president. You're in the president's club. You don't want the next president questioning your legacy, as you see what happens with Trump. That's why Trump is the one president that's attacked by all the other presidents, is because Trump, even though we've had pretty much the same policies as the Bush administration on most issues, Jeb Bush hates him because, he was, he attacked Jeb, he attacked the insider Republicans, he attacked McCain, and like he wasn't cordial about it. And so even though he just did most of the same terrible policies as the Bush administration, most of the insider Republicans hated him, as did all the Democrats, even though the Democrats like George Bush, and they'll post pictures of him with Ellen and laughing with Michelle Obama and this and that, because he's like kind of a lovable guy, even though like he objectively did probably worse things than Trump even did in terms of like, did Trump invade Iraq? Like, name something that Trump did that's worse than invading Iraq. Like, you can't think of anything. But Bush is okay, Trump is not. And so he says that, Obama says, but the actual wars in Afghanistan and Iraq hadn't involved the indiscriminate bombing or deliberate targeting of civilians that had been a routine part of even good wars like World War II. And so because the U.S. wasn't deliberately targeting civilians, like, that's some credit for George Bush. You didn't deliberately target civilians. If you i.e. what terrorists do. So you didn't intentionally target civilians. Instead, you just, he says there was no indiscriminate bombing. First of all, there was. Actually, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it was called shock and awe. That was the shock and awe. We'll see how much stuff we can blow up as quickly as possible so we can shock and awe them. So that is, even though it wasn't, they probably weren't targeting, schools in order to kill as many children as possible. If you're trying to shock and awe, by definition, you're going to lose some safety precautions. And there was many thousands of people that died from that as well. Not to mention what happens when you overthrew the government in a volatile region and had no plan to do anything other than to extract the oil and assert U.S. influence. The entire region is destroyed, and that's led to a lot of consequences in the aftermath. But Obama's going to go ahead and give Bush credit here, because you need to find things to give Bush credit for, because, again, he's part of the club, and, you disagree on this or that, but fundamentally, he's kind of your guy right now. And he says deliberate targeting of civilians that had been a routine part of the good wars like World War II, which is true. I mean, the U.S. bombed, or the Allies bombed Dresden and Tokyo indiscriminately and killed hundreds of thousands of people. But that's not a defense. It was like, but you get credit for not doing that. Also, World War II was kind of first of all, it was like 70 or 80 years prior, 70 years prior. And also the U.S., it was kind of a bigger, the world was about to come to an end. You can understand why they might have gone a little bit overboard. And this one, 3,000 people died, not 60 million. And the U.S., it was, 2 years later, and it was just the U.S. deciding how many people to kill pretty much out of nowhere, a country that didn't even attack us. So it's not quite an equivalent analogy, but there's some brownie points from Obama for Bush. And he says, with glaring exceptions like Abu Ghraib, Abu Ghraib was not the only exception, but with exceptions like that, our troops in the theater had displayed a remarkable level of discipline and professionalism. I think that's quite an exaggeration. If any country had invaded the U.S. and then done things like Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay, or the torture that happened in Afghanistan at the airbase there, which name is escaping me, or any of the other, there was a lot. It was not just Abu Ghraib. There was extraordinary rendition programs. There was there was Blackwater and U.S. contractors just indiscriminately killing people, which is something that continued, maybe not for contractors at the same level as during the Bush administration, but during the Obama administration, just night raids in the middle of nowhere in Pakistan, killing people indiscriminately, not to mention I don't know what he's talking about, to be honest with you. There's so many exceptions that it's hard to claim after all of them that the rule was we didn't do it. The only way that you can get to that is if, by definition, the rule is our intentions are always the best. And so each of these exceptions are exactly that. They're things that we can discount because fundamentally, because of our exceptionalism and who we are as a people, and what the character of people like George Bush, that was kind of an accident, and that's not the core thing to pay attention to. And then Obama starts talking about how he's going to reform the Bush-era counterterrorism programs. And he says that, as I saw it, my job was to fix those aspects of our counterterrorism effort that needed fixing, rather than tearing it out, root and branch, to start over. And he's like, one of the things we're going to do is try to close Guantanamo, something that he actually never did in 8 years. But then he's like, we're going to try to do this. We're going to try to institute legal frameworks into this and that, which I'll get to. But he says, for that, I needed the fresh eyes and critical mindset of mostly liberal lawyers who worked under me in the White House, Pentagon, CIA, and State Department counsel's office. But I also needed someone who had operated at the very center of U.S. CT efforts, someone who could help me sort through the various policy trade-offs that were sure to come, and then reach into the bowels of the system to make sure that the needed change actually happened. So he's like, okay, we need to make some changes here. I don't want to really change things, but we need to tinker around at some aspects that aren't working quite perfectly. The American military machine is not operating quite as efficiently, and here's Obama, the moderate, to come, tinker with it and rebrand it. And in order to do that, we're going to have the liberal people from the CIA, the State Department, and the Pentagon, and then we're also going to have the conservative people who were at the heart of the problem prior. And he says that the conservative person that we're going to give this to is John Brenan. And then he's like, in his early 50s with thinning gray hair and a face of an Irish boxer, he had blah, 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 blah. He did this, he did that, he was smart, he did this, he was a nice guy. Long sentences about all these great people that he's working with. One of the things that John Brennan did during the Obama administration is that there was, I don't know if you've seen I forget what it's called, the Torture Report. I think that's a movie that was made about it. But that movie was made about the efforts of some lawyers to reveal the U.S. torture during the Bush administration. And there was actually a Senate report that was being compiled by Dianne Feinstein, the one good thing that she ever did, even though she usually is licking the boots of the Pentagon. She was compiling this report because for a long list of reasons, the CIA had just gone too far, and they were like, okay, we're gonna actually compile this report. Well, John Brennan broke into the computers of the Senate aides of Dianne Feinstein and others within that committee and stole all the data, trying to figure out what was going to be in that report.
As far as the allegations of CIA hacking into Senate computers, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, we wouldn't do that.
So this is a guy that literally robbed important classified information from a senator and had no repercussions at all, and now is an MSNBC contributor. That's just one little. So if you're in power, you can do whatever you want, and Obama will write long overtures with you after promoting you from the Bush administration to redo and tinker with the program that you ran against the Bush administration doing, and then now you work for MSNBC. And then the next paragraph, Obama's like this book just keeps on giving. Just when you think you're done, it drags me back. It's like, I don't want to talk. Do you think I want to talk this long? I do not want to. He's like, still, Brenan had been, so he says all these great things about Brenan. Still, Brenan had been at the CIA when waterboarding took place, and that association made him a non-starter as my first agency director. And so he's like, okay, well, he's a great family man, but he was a torturer. We tortured some folks, as Obama would put it.
We tortured some folks.
And so he's like, that's going to be a non-starter as director of the CIA, as the first director. And so what he's like is okay, the change has come. No more tortures as my first director for the CIA. Instead, we'll put you into another high position and then make you the second director of the CIA, which is what Obama did. And as a director there, he broke into the Senate aides' computers to steal information about the torture that he had took place at the CIA when he was there prior in order to cover his ass because and then had no repercussions for it because that's how it works in Washington. But yeah, not the first director, the second director. So you waterboard too many people, there could be repercussions for you. You might not be the first director of the CIA when the new administration comes in. If you smoke some marijuana, you might be a felon for the rest of your life and not be able to get a job. If you waterboard some folks, you might not be the first director of the CIA when the liberal president comes in. So there are repercussions for our actions, people. And so Obama's about to give a big speech to the Muslim world to bridge the cultural divide between Arab nations and the West. And in leading up to that speech, he talks about the situation, and he says that surveys showed that Muslims around the world believe the United States was hostile towards their religion, and that our Middle East policy was based not on an interest in improving people's lives, but rather on maintaining oil supplies, killing terrorists, and protecting Israel. And so Obama's like, well, there's there's just a disconnect here between the two countries. I need to get them to realize that the U.S.'s interest is in improving people's lives. And so the way to do that is through the speech, not through changing the things that we've been doing, because it's just been a huge misunderstanding. We've been out here trying to improve people's lives, overthrowing Iran, invading all these Middle Eastern countries. We have dozens, if not hundreds of bases in the Middle East alone, and we give money to despots and we prop them up. And when there's a giant revolution, the Arab Spring, that happens under my watch a couple of years later, I decide that the best way to improve people's lives is to stand in the way of that revolution as much as possible, despite my convictions as an idealist. Is anything that Obama said here actually controversial? That Muslims think that their policy isn't improving people's lives, but rather on maintaining oil supplies? Who would oil has there's a big misconception that oil and wealth and power is what kind of directs nations and their decision-making processes. But actually, the United States, we're kind of different. We just happen to be the wealthiest country with all our, with our hands on all the levers of power around the world and all the control of the oil. And all, when we buy oil from Saudi Arabia or any country, it gets transferred into petrodollars, which pumps up the U.S. dollar. And we sell weapons to these countries to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. But this is just a coincidence because our interest is in improving people's lives. If you've ever studied political science, countries compete with each. It's in an Arctic world, and if you're a realist, you realize that countries are interested in improving people's lives at the to the detriment of maintaining their own power domestically. Obama's like, okay, we need to clear up this miscommunication, this misconception that the U.S. isn't here to improve people's lives, and so I'm going to have to admit some things. It says it meant admitting past U.S. indifference towards corruption. So there was indifference towards corruption in the past, but that's a thing of the past. But I'm going to admit it. They used to be that way. It's there was little exceptions here and there as we were trying to improve people's lives. There was a little bit corruption back in the 1950s, our complicity in the overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government during the Cold War. So if you go back to ancient history, like there was a couple things that we might have did which weren't improving people's lives, which might have made you think that like we were here for the oil, but it was just a huge miscommunication this whole time. And the searing humiliations endured by Palestinians living in the occupied territory. So that wasn't acknowledged before, and so now I've acknowledged it, and now look at it. Like now look at Palestine, like the separate state of Palestine made huge strides over the 8 years after I acknowledged that I'm sorry you're living in squalor under an illegal occupation of a regime that we give, about $5 billion a year in military aid to, so they can expand settlements into your territory and continue that occupation at gunpoint. But we're going to acknowledge that in the past, you might have been humiliated by it. Hearing such a basic history from the mouth of a U.S. president would catch many people off guard. It's like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to catch you off guard. I'm going to say we messed up before, and I'm going to continue doing what we did before while acknowledging that we did it in the past. Obama, to his credit, actually has a pretty good synopsis of Saudi Arabia. So he's in Saudi Arabia right now. He's about to give this big speech, but right here he's kind of describing what it's like in Saudi Arabia. And he says correctly, the Saudi monarchy struck a bargain with its most hardline clerics in exchange for legitimizing the House of Saud's absolute control over the nation's economy and government. The clerics and religious police were granted authority to regulate daily social interactions, determine what was taught in the schools, and mete out punishments to those who violated religious decrees, from public floggings to the removal of hands to actual crucifixions. You thought the crucifixions stopped thousands of years ago, but no, they're going strong in Saudi Arabia, our ally, Saudi Arabia, that we give billions of dollars to so that they can crucify people for, sorcery. They literally chop people's heads off for sorcery in Saudi Arabia. Maybe they crucify them too. And that's your tax dollars hard at work. Obama's telling it like it is here. So he's like, this is how it is. Let's see what he does as he's the president to confront the crucifixion nation. Perhaps more important, the royal family steered billions of dollars to these same clerics to build mosques and madrasas across the Sunni world. As a result, from Pakistan to Egypt to Mali to Indonesia, fundamentalism grew stronger, tolerance for different Islamic practices grew weaker, drives to impose Islamic governments grew louder, and calls for purging of Western influences from Islamic territory through violence if necessary grew more frequent. The Saudi monarchy could take satisfaction in having averted an Iranian-style revolution, both within its borders and among its Gulf partners. And then he goes on to say here, but it done so at the price of accelerating a transnational fundamentalist movement that despised Western influence, removed suspicious Saudi dalliances with the United States, and served as a petri dish for the radicalization of many young Muslims. Men like Osama bin Laden, the son of a prominent Saudi businessman, close to the royal family, and the 15 Saudi nationalists who, along with 4 others, planned and carried out the September 11th attacks. So Obama's like laying it out right here. He's like, look, pretty much all of terrorism, everything that we think of terrorism, 9/11 planned by, people very close to people high up within the Saudi Arabian government, within ideology that's very close to the Wahhabist, Salafist, doctrine, which Saudi Arabia literally exports to the tune of billions of dollars by creating and funding madrasas, which are essentially, Sunni-based religious schools where they're taught this stuff, and does that throughout the Muslim world. This is what Saudi Arabia does. They carry out 9/11. And so going back a page, if you remember when Obama said that, there's a misconception that like the U.S. isn't there to improve people's lives. If you were to believe like that on its face, that is the U.S.'s driving interest, like the U.S. policymakers must be really stupid because like they know there's crucifixions here, they know there's public floggings, they know that they're chopping off people's hands for doing things against the religious police's decree, and they know that they're exporting that ideology around the Muslim world that is expanding terrorism. And Obama, if you go back, he says that the misconception, there's an idea that that's what the U.S. is there for, and not to, go after terrorists. And it's like, okay, if the U.S.'s goal is to reduce terrorism, and they're literally funding the most terrorist state, is the only logical conclusion that the U.S. had just like made a mistake before, or are there fundamental undercurrents that keep the money flowing in that direction and keep the U.S. from exerting any influence on our ally within the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. This is like this. Everything he said here is true, but it's like it's happened for a reason. Like the U.S. is happy to look the other way as terrorism is exported throughout the Middle East and people's human rights is violated as their hands are chopped off and they're freaking nailed to a cross. But only if the oil keeps flowing. And so Obama knows all of this. All U.S. policymakers know all of this, but again, they're in power because they've accommodated themselves to that system, because there's just too much money involved, too much power involved, and it would be going against the grain too much for those people to do that. As soon as they'd be kicked to the curb, or there'd be domestic political pressures against them from private power that they probably couldn't withstand. It wouldn't be good for their career. So if you want to put it in your memoir, 8 years, 4 years after you're out of office, after you're president for 4 years, what's actually happening there, you can do that. But when you actually go to Saudi Arabia, here's what happened when he actually went. Like King Abdullah died. He cut short his trip in India. This is a couple of years later, and he flew to Saudi Arabia right away to show his respects to the guy that instituted all these programs. You got to show your respect. You got to kiss the ring. Like you got to know where power lies. You got to know when not to raise your head and say anything about it, and that's when you actually could do anything. And the time to have a long paragraph on page 361 of your third memoir where you criticize this so that you get brownie points for actually saying something about it. When you have no influence after you're not president, that's what you can do. 4 years later. So Obama knows his role. So Obama's in Saudi Arabia, and he's in his room, and apparently the Saudis have left a bunch of jewelry and gold watches in his room and all the other U.S. diplomats' room as bribes or gifts or something. And Obama, of course, doesn't accept them because he's an emblem of anti-corruption. He says, a little something for the missus, Dennis said. He explained the others in the delegation has found the cases with expensive watches waiting for them in their rooms. Apparently, nobody told the Saudis about our prohibition on gifts. Lifting the heavy jewelry, I wondered how many gifts like this had been discreetly left for other leaders during official visits to the kingdom. Leaders whose country didn't have rules against taking gifts, or at least not the ones that were enforced. I thought again about the Somali pirates I had ordered killed, Muslims all, and many young men like them across the nearby borders of Yemen, Iraq, and in Egypt, Jordan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, whose earnings in a lifetime would probably never touch the cost of that necklace in my hands. Radicalize just 1% of those young people, and you had yourself an army of 500,000. Oof. Ready to die for eternal glory, or maybe just a taste of something better. I set the necklace down and closed the case. All right, I said, let's get to work. Let's get to work. It's time to change that. He's like, I frauded about thinking about the young, poor Muslims around the world that, would never be able to touch any wealth as it's hoarded by this gigantic, monarchy, despot monarchy at the top that's trying to bribe me right now. And I said, I didn't like that. And then I got to work. The end. Did you do anything about it? Because it seems like they're still in power and we're still propping them up, and we still sold them weapons to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars and kept the oil flowing and kept the petrodollars coming back to the U.S., and nothing was done to fundamentally change or address that at all. But good. It's all right, let's get to work. Yeah, let's get to work. You were president for 8 years. Did you do anything? No, you didn't do anything. Here's what Obama did. He wrote about it 4 years later. He, continued the shipment of weapons as Saudi Arabia destroyed Yemen in his second term, which he doesn't write about here because he needs a new book to get to that. In page 497, paragraph 2 is a new book. I'm sure he's going to talk about how we funded them, tons of weapons as well as intelligence so that they could kill people in Yemen to the tune of tens of thousands of people that nobody even knows about what's happened in Yemen. But he's like, oh yeah, let's get to work. Right here, he's talking about getting to work. He's like, we give them weapons, we buy their oil, we don't challenge them fundamentally, we fly to their country to kiss the ring during the funeral of their leader, and nothing at all. But it's he thinks that he's getting points for acknowledging that he knows that he should have done something and then not doing anything. So then Obama meets with Jose Mubarak in Egypt when he was still in power. And he has a good sentence here. He says that after meeting with Mubarak, I was left with an impression that would become all too familiar in my dealings with aging autocrats. Shut away in palaces, their every interaction mediated by the hard-faced, obsequious functionaries that surrounded them, they were unable to distinguish between their personal interests and those of their nations. Their actions governed by no broader purpose beyond maintaining the tangled web of patronage and business interests that kept them in power. Do you know the thing I'm going to say? You might have been, this is I don't know, hour 4, hour 5, hour 8, hour 3. you might have been watching this for a while. Do you know the thing I'm going to say? Are you on my wavelength yet? Yes, I think that is a good characterization of people in power and how they justify their own behavior. Some people in power will, equate the nation's interests with their own personal interests, so that when they act transparently in their own personal interests, bailing out Wall Street, not helping poor people, continuing wars, they're able to justify that as by being in the broader interests of the nation and the people of the nation, and thereby maintain their tangled web of patronage and business interests that kept them in power. And then some of the more savvy ones will write retrospective memoirs about other people that did that transparently, criticizing them and thereby implying that they are somehow different. So then Obama delivers a speech and then kind of has a retrospective about his interaction with the Muslim world and whether or not his lofty ideals that were presented in those speech actually, was followed through with. And so he says, in later years, critics and even some of my supporters would have a field day contrasting the lofty, hopeful tone of the Cairo speech with the grim realities that would play out in the Middle East during my 2 terms in office. For some, it showed the sin of naivete, one that undermined key U.S. allies like Mubarak and thus emboldened the forces of chaos. For others, the problem was the forces of chaos. As we prop up Saudi Arabia, which I just acknowledge is the force that's exporting all the chaos across the Middle East, any challenge to that, as subtle and non-direct as they are, that could unleash the forces of chaos. This is what Obama's saying people are criticizing for. He's like, some people say I was too hard on these people by saying a couple things passive-aggressively in a speech once. Okay, yeah, that's one way that you could paint yourself if actually trying to do something about it is saying, again, this is what he always does. He's like, everybody says that I do too much, but I'm not going to apologize for trying. That's not what they're saying. That's not what the YouTube commentators in the forest are saying. Who's saying that? The people that are saying that are, again, he's amalgamated a consortium of business interests that represent the Republican Party all the way to the Nancy Pelosi end of the Democratic Party. And some people over here said that you might have went too far, and the other people are like, that's okay what you did. Really, you didn't do anything at all. But this is all that he hears because he's, as he said a couple pages ago, he has a tangled web of patronage and business interests that kept them in power, as he described other autocrats. But yeah, that is what maybe some of them would say, and it is a useful tool in order to paint yourself as just being overly optimistic and idealistic in your actions. That's a much better legacy to have than a power-hungry sellout who accommodated himself to the worst forces in the world in order to be able to write memoirs like this and be in history books later. So Obama continues. He says, I was tempted to answer, of course, to point out that I was the first to say that no single speech would solve that region's long-standing challenges. So Obama's like, my critics said that, this speech would solve everything. But I knew that a speech couldn't solve all the problems in the Middle East. So they were wrong. No, actually, your critics were saying, hey, maybe you should have done the things that you said you were going to do in your speech. And if you had done those things, then the Middle East would actually be in a better situation right now. It's not the straw man that your critics thought that your speech was what was going to solve it. They thought the things that you said you would do in your speech were the things that would solve it. And you didn't do those things. But now you're saying that they thought that it was the speech itself. That we'd push hard on everyday initiatives I mentioned that day, whether large, like a deal between the Israelis and Palestinians, which I'm not going to get into right now because that would be another 15-minute tangent, but suffice it to say that the major impediment to a two-state solution was the U.S. constantly undermining the prospect for a two-state solution based on UN 242, roughly along the June 1967 borders, which the entire world acknowledges, and supports, but the U.S. always vetoes when it comes to a resolution in the Security Council, at the same time as they're giving the Netanyahu government billions of dollars each year for weapons, which they use to kill the Palestinians and then bulldoze over their lands and construct more on occupied territories, making the prospect for a two-state solution worse when you left office than when you got into office. Like, Obama knows all of these things. He says, or the creation of training programs for would-be entrepreneurs. Okay, maybe he did some of that. I actually have no idea. Obama is like, hey, we're going to change up fundamentally what happened in the Middle East, and look what I did. The creation of training programs for would-be entrepreneurs. Like, I have no idea what he's talking about. In the meantime, like, the Middle East is being destroyed. ISIS, freaking no settlement in Israel, Palestine. I'm going to undermine the Arab Spring. But look at this. I helped create this initiative for training programs for would-be entrepreneurs. And so, dozens of Arabs in, Bahrain learned how to code. So that, that's, take that, monarchies and despots, which I'm not able to confront. But he says, in the end, the facts of what happened are the facts, and I'm left with the same set of questions I first wrestled with as a young organizer. How useful it is to describe the world as it should be when efforts to achieve the world are bound to fall short. Was Valclav Havel correct in suggesting that by raising expectations, I was doomed to disappoint them? Was it possible that abstract principles and high-minded ideals were and always would be nothing more than a pretense, a palliative, a way to beat back despair, no match for the more primal urges that really moved us, so that no matter what we said or did, history was sure to run along its predetermined course, an endless cycle of fear, hunger, conflict, dominance, and weakness, says the retrospective, scholar, Obama, activist. It's like, did I try to, was I shown that nothing can really change? Smallest violin. You didn't do anything. You didn't try anything, and now you're rebranding it as like, look, like maybe I was too idealistic, and that was what my naivete as I dealt with these people. There is no examples in here where you did anything to fundamentally challenge pretty much anything. He's like, I'll tinker here. Here's a training program for would-be entrepreneurs, somehow it didn't change. Like, yeah, no, it didn't change because you didn't try to change it. And so the chapter's coming to an end, and so Obama puts back on his poet hat and goes, thinking in the forest as he writes his concluding paragraph here. He says, maybe nothing would come of my Cairo speech. Maybe the dysfunction of the Middle East would play itself out regardless of what I did. Maybe the best we could hope for was to placate men like Mubarak and kill those who tried to kill us. Maybe, as the pyramids had whispered, none of it mattered in the long run. And so he's like, maybe, the pyramids are whispering to me as spiritual Obama reflects on the nature of humanity. And in doing so, they're whispering to him, you can't do anything, placate Mubarak, continue killing people in the drone program. So it's not like the establishment or the defense contractors, which he put in his administration, or all the people that led him to getting to power that are telling him this. The pyramids were whispering it to him. The kind of the historical nature of Obama's reflections, just on a grand scale and time scale that most of us lay people can't understand, as the magnificent Renaissance man reflects on humanity itself. That's what led him to the conclusion that we need to placate people like Mubarak and kiss the ring of the Saudis and continue to kill people that try to kill us. And maybe they're trying to kill us because we've killed lots of their people and we're propping up people like Mubarak and the Saudis also. And Obama has acknowledged all of this at some point. But again, the pyramids are whispering to him, like, Cleopatra and, just the spirit of humanity. Millennia in the sand are what's telling him this, and so the chapter ends. So the start of chapter 16, Ted Kennedy is starting to pass away, and so Obama needs to reflect on his legacy, and so he says that through 7 presidents, Teddy had fought the good fight. During the Clinton administration, he'd helped secure passage of the Children's Health Insurance Program. Over the objections of some in his own party, he worked with President Bush to get drug coverage for seniors. And so, look, he's just willing to do whatever, is right for the American people. I actually kind of like Ted Kennedy. He did a lot of good stuff, but he's bringing up, working with the Bush administration to expand to expand Medicare to include prescription drugs, which was good for some seniors, but it also, like the Republicans complain about the debt, they weren't complaining about this because this was unfunded, and this led to an explosion of the debt, in large part because one of the provisions that was put in that thing was that Medicare was unable to negotiate prescription drug prices with corporations. And so essentially it was the taxpayer footing the bill for more revenue going towards prescription drug companies who by law made it so that they're paying as much as possible for those drugs. So it's like, yeah, that was good for some seniors, but it's essentially a giveaway. The corporations are all for government spending and big government as long as the money flows in their direction. So we spend, $800 billion a year on the military and on bombs and weapons. That's fine because the money goes into the coffers of defense contractors. And yeah, the Republicans are like, oh yeah, we can expand Medicaid. We can get some people some prescription drugs coverage here, as long as all the money goes to corporations at as high of expense as possible to the taxpayers, because fundamentally they're not concerned about cost or the debt itself. They're concerned about making sure that corporations are ripping off people as much as possible and making as much profit as possible. And if that means big government stepping in to spend more money to go to those corporations, that's fine. And so Obama's going to use that as like an example of like, you know, the great things that Ted Kennedy did. Stood up to the Democrats. Some of the Democrats didn't want to give all those money to the pharmaceutical industry, but Ted said, no, we're going to do that. So Obama starts talking about healthcare reform, which was his biggest legislative accomplishment, which was Obamacare, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. And he says that he kind of gives, like, you know, both sides of the story, why we haven't been able to get universal coverage. And he says that, meanwhile, defenders of the status quo could point to the many innovations brought to the market by for-profit medical industry, from MRIs to life-saving drugs. So he's like, let's not be too radical. These for-profit companies are doing a lot of great things for the medical industry, like MRIs and life-saving drugs. There is some of that, but a couple things. First of all, the amount of money that is spent on actual research by like pharmaceutical companies in comparison to their other costs, especially advertising, is like it's a fraction of it. They spend way more money on advertising drugs, which they try to market as high as price as possible, than they actually spend on giving on the research for those drugs. And a huge amount of the research that's done by them is funded by the government. Actually, I worked at the U of O, and you see, like, there's all these government grants that are going into research at all these labs across the country, at universities and other places as well. And if there's a breakthrough, what always happens is that that will get privatized and go to the pharmaceutical companies who will mass produce it and maybe tinker with it or make it a little bit better. But it's like the public research that goes in towards finding these drugs is very high. It's just that there's the socialism is reversed, and so the cost is brought on by the public. And then if there is ever a breakthrough, it's taken on by the corporations, who would much rather not spend their money on research and spend very little of it on it, and instead spend their money on marketing, trying to push as many pills as possible to people at as high a price as possible. And so it's like, okay, yeah, no, there is some good things that the private industry will do, but it's like they're trying to spend as little money as possible on this research, because research is expensive. Like, they'd rather have a sure deal and rather have the taxpayer pay for that. So Obama kind of gives his synopsis of the problems of the healthcare system, which is partially correct and partially incorrect, but I'm not going to run through the whole thing here. But he just goes through it, and then he says, all this explained why the United States spend a lot more money per person on healthcare than any other advanced economy. 112% more than Canada, 109% more than France, 117% more than Japan, for similar or worse results. So in other words, we are spending twice as much on healthcare, have 20 million people uninsured still, and these other countries have universal care, and we don't even get better healthcare results. And so if that's not a dysfunctional system, I don't know what it is. The difference amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars each year, money that could have been used to provide quality health, child care for American families, or to reduce college tuition, or to eliminate a good chunk of the federal deficit. And so, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. The funny thing is that Obama's about to justify. It's like, where are we right now? We have healthcare costs have continued to increase since the ACA passed, because the fundamental system itself, which is a for-profit system, which says that making as much money as possible is what is going to be the driving incentives for the hospitals, for the pharmaceutical companies, for the healthcare companies, and not providing care at affordable prices. Like, you can have one or you can have the other, but if you're not willing to challenge the private power which pushes forward this system and the lobbyists and the special interests, which Obama is not, then all you can do is tinker with the previous system, which is good that, like, he did expand healthcare coverage so that, I don't know, like, only, I think right now, I think it went down to like 17 million Americans were uninsured. So he got more people insured. But other than that, it's like the costs are higher than ever, and they continue to rise because the fundamental system itself was not changed. And so Obama kind of needs to set the stage and the narrative for the rest of the chapter. For what the forces he's up against and the situation with the healthcare reform bill, as well as his own motives for trying to push for this. And so here he's arguing with his advisors whether or not they should try to do anything to help people. And he's in the middle of it. He's arguing with Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod, and he says, Rahm Emanuel says that, I know that, Mr. President, but the American people don't know that Obama's been helping with the economy so much. And they say, so what are we saying here, I asked. Despite having the biggest Democratic majority in decades, despite the promises we made during the campaign, we shouldn't try to get health care done? Rahm looked at Axe for help. They're both saying, no, we shouldn't do anything. We all think we should try, Axe said. We just need to know that if we lose, your presidency will be badly weakened. And nobody understands that better than McConnell and Boehner. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. We better not lose then, I said. And so here's the situation. He has the biggest majority in decades, and he made a bunch of promises to them, and he's doing the right thing by standing up to his own advisors, which he pointed there, which are saying, don't do anything at all. And so Obama's like, sorry, we're going to do something. Well, let's see what he's actually going to do. That's what the rest of the chapter is going to be about. And it turns out he's really not going to hardly change anything at all. And he admits very, very quickly that he does not want to take on any established special interest and really only wants to tinker with the system. But even that he needs to like frame in a representation of it as being like just taking on everybody, when he's admittedly taking on very few of the special interests, which he actually promised to run against, while framing it as taking on all of them, despite it being against his own political interests. Totally untrue. And so then Obama starts actually talking about the way that he wants to get healthcare reform done. And just kind of as a background, like there are two major ways that you can actually pass legislation in Congress. Like right now, there's currently a lot of gridlock, but there are still like two ways that you can actually get things to pass. The most common way, and the way that's been happening, pretty much my whole lifetime, is that you kind of amalgamate a coalition of stakeholders, special interests that have the current positions in Washington, which is overwhelmingly dominated by big money and corporations and the wealthiest people and companies within the country, special interests essentially, which donate the most to political campaigns, have the most lobbyists by a factor of like 100, and they have their finger on Washington. So nothing's really gonna be passed if it undermines their collective interests fundamentally. And so there are ways to if you accept that framework, there are ways to pass things. And what you have to do is you have to tinker around the edges, and you have to give up things to this industry and give up things to that special interest, and then maybe like you can get slight concessions or slightly tinker around the edges in a way that might marginally benefit people on the aggregate without fundamentally changing the systems by making it more efficient. The other way that you can actually pass things is the way that any major legislation has really ever been passed, whether it was the New Deal reforms or the Great Society reforms of the 1960s, or the environmental movement, or the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act during the Civil Rights era, or even like abolition, like even like getting rid of slavery. If people in the 1840s were like, okay, well, we have to work with the current stakeholders, like the situation on the ground is like these people are too powerful, like cotton is bringing in too much revenue for us to like take them on. And so if the politicians or the activists all had to say, okay, we need to figure out a way to make slavery better without really challenging any of these fundamental assumptions about what the right way to operate a society is, or take on any of their financial interests, then maybe you could like reduce like the amount of lashes that a slave would get, or like slightly benefit their standard of living, or maybe like get like subsidies for their food, which would be better for slaves and also better for the slave owners, because then they have to spend less. And so you could like get like some type of thing like that, which wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing, but it's like fundamentally, if there's like a giant problem within the system, you have to take on some of the stakeholders that are the problem. And my fundamental gripe with Obama in this book as a whole is just that he had no willingness or intention of taking on any of the stakeholders, while at the same time he frames it, he promised to do so to millions of people when he said he would get elected, and then like frames it in a way of like, I wanted to really badly, but like I'm a realist and I just wanted to help people, and so I had to get let go of my youthful convictions, which are really at my center in favor of working with all these special interests. No, like there was the political will from the actual grassroots that got you elected to take them on, and you ended up being the impediment for that change by justifying your incrementalism and your selling out to those very special interests. And so 12 pages later, Obama describes more of the actual process in creating this bill, the sausage making, as it were. And so he says, because of his own inclinations and his interest in producing a bipartisan bill, Baucus hoped to avoid anything that could be characterized as a tax increase. Instead, he and his staff calculated the windfall profits that a new flood of insured customers would bring the hospitals, drug companies, and insurers, and use those figures as a basis of negotiating billions of dollars in upfront contributions through fees or Medicare payment reductions from each industry. To sweeten the deal, Baucus was also prepared to make certain policy concessions. For example, he compromised the pharmaceutical. He promised I should have said compromise. He compromised and promised the pharmaceutical lobbyists that his bill wouldn't include provisions allowing the reimportation of drugs from Canada, a popular Democratic proposal that highlighted the way Canadian and European government-run healthcare systems use their massive bargaining power to negotiate much cheaper prices than Big Pharma charged inside the United States. It's absolutely true, and Obama's acknowledging that his big change platform was going out of the way to make sure that the pharmaceutical industry could charge Americans whatever they want for drugs. Politically and he didn't like it though. So politically and emotionally, I would have found it a lot more satisfying to just go after the drug and insurance companies and see if we could beat them into submissions. So he would have loved to do that. They were wildly unpopular with voters, absolutely true, and for good reason. But as a practical matter, it was hard to argue with Baucus's more conciliatory approach. We had no way to get 60 votes in the Senate for a major healthcare bill without at least a tacit agreement for the big industry players. And so he had no way of getting 60 votes in the Senate unless we compromised with the most corrupt, right-wing insurance, pharmaceutical, healthcare, hospital, lobbyist, compromised members of Congress, and just somehow patch a smoke-filled room compromise deal together and then give that as our major healthcare reform to the people. By this logic, it's like, I'm sorry, like we'd love to get the Civil Rights Act passed, but look, here it's 1960 and we only have 44 votes for it. So if we are going to get anything, we're going to need to compromise with 16, Dixiecrats and Republicans that are racist in the South that are supportive of segregation, and if we're going to get anything. So he's like, okay, so let's say that's what LBJ had done in 1965. He's like, okay, well, there's all these racists in Congress and we need to compromise with them to get a Civil Rights Act passed. What are we going to do? We've got 44 good votes and we need to get 16 more votes. And so for these other 16 votes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to promise that, okay, we're going to have integration, but still the schools are going to have an extra wall between, they're going to be in the same school, but the whites and the blacks will be in a different school, and we were able to get some more, funding for better drinking fountains in the segregated areas of parks for the African American community, which isn't perfect, but this is how the sausage is made. But in order to do that, we need to give an extra, $100 million in pork barrel spending to the special interests in Alabama, and we're going to do this and that, and then at the end of the day, look, it's a little bit better in the South in 1966 than it was in 1959, and this is just how politics is done. Obama the activist understood or says that he understood that again, changing things means putting pressure on politicians through actual grassroots movement and representing the people rather than the special interests. Obama, the healthcare reformer, is going out of the way, despite having a gigantic majority and all of the American people on his side, to work with those special interests and then saying that he had no choice. It's completely incorrect. Drug reimportation was a great political issue, but at the end of the day, we didn't have the votes for it. So, we didn't have the votes. How are we going to end slavery? We don't have the votes. How are we going to, get the EPA passed? There are no votes for it. It's 1962. People don't care about clean air and clean water. We just can't get the EPA. Do you know who passed the EPA and the most environmental regulations in modern in history? It was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon doesn't care about the environment, but he did it because the movements pushed him to do it. And so again, Obama's main thesis here is we're not going to challenge any of the special interests. We're going to work with the pharmaceutical companies to ban reimportation. We're going to work with the insurance companies and the hospitals to make sure that the windfall profits that a new flood of insured customers would bring to them, that's going to be the leverage that we use in order to get support on some of the other things. And so rather than taking on the fundamental problem, which is a private for-profit healthcare system which wants to maximize profits, which means increasing expenses for people, whether it's for drug purchasing or for healthcare or at the hospitals. There was just a report that showed that that hospitals are charging around 18 times, so 1,800% the actual costs of the services that they're doing to customers, which I totally would believe because I had the experience in a hospital recently where I found out they were charging, I think they were charging like $45 for like a small bowl of mac and cheese. And it's like, okay, yeah, no, that you would do that. And that's all across the board, every industry, whether it's hospitals, medical equipment suppliers, pharmaceuticals, obviously, or the health insurance companies themselves, they're all trying to make as much money as possible, and they're all kind of ripping each other off as well as American people. And so part of the reason the healthcare prices are so high is because the pharmaceutical companies will try to charge as much as possible for it, but they're all ripping the American people off, and for all of them, the fundamental problem is the for-profit nature of it. That's a reason that we don't have universal coverage, is because at the end of the day, insurance companies do not want to cover people that have pre-existing conditions. That's why the fight for getting the pre-existing conditions in here was like the only major concession they could get, and it took giving the house away on 100 different issues to get it. They don't want to cover sick people, they don't want to cover old people, and the people that they do want to cover, they want to charge as much as possible while giving as little service as possible, which is why for even people that are insured, they have high deductibles. I'm sure people know what I'm talking about. High co-payments, so you have to pay a lot of money even after you have the insurance. And then there's lifetime caps on the insurance, and they'll max out. And so the insurance isn't even really health insurance, and it's still way more costly than other countries are doing for it. All of this comes back to the healthcare system itself being for profit. It's like you can have a healthcare system that has a goal of giving people the best healthcare for the lowest cost universally, or you can have, and that's be your driving goal, or you can have the goal of the healthcare system to be maximizing returns for shareholders of all these various special interests. This is the U.S. system, and Obama's totally accommodating himself to that, and then saying you couldn't do anything. But like for the Bretton Woods system, which FDR, helped reform the global banking system at the tail end of World War II. They were like, okay, how are we going to, reconstruct the banking system in a way to benefit, people going forward? And there was an industry which was not allowed at the table there. He made sure to not allow the banking industry or any bankers to be present at Bretton Woods. Contrast that to Obama. He was going out of the way to make sure that all of these special interests have a seat at the table and are the ones actually crafting the legislation. If you do that, you can't get any fundamental change. And so then Obama describes where he got his healthcare plan from. And he got it from Mitt Romney. And Mitt Romney got his plan from the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank that, like back in, I think, the 80s, came up with a plan to counteract the left-wing plan of universal coverage and a single-payer system that mirrors the rest of the developed world's healthcare, which is much more efficient and universal. And so they came up with a counter plan which empowered the private industry, which Mitt Romney copied that Heritage Foundation plan, instituted in Massachusetts, and then, as Obama says, Obama used that plan as his scaffolding to construct the ACA. And so what was that plan? These two ideas, the individual mandate and protecting people with pre-existing conditions, went hand in hand. So it was individual mandate and pre-existing conditions were the center point from it. With a huge new pool of government-subsidized customers, insurance no longer had an excuse for trying to cherry-pick only the young and healthy for coverage to protect their profits. Meanwhile, the mandate ensured that people couldn't game the system by waiting until they got sick to purchase insurance. Touting the plan to reporters, Romney called the individual mandate the ultimate conservative idea because it promoted personal responsibility. And so what Obama did is he used all the movement energy for real healthcare reform that he had promised, and he co-opted the ultimate conservative idea and made that into his plan. Yeah, it is the ultimate conservative idea because conservatives have no problem with government spending a lot of money on anything as long as the money goes back to shareholders and billionaires and millionaires. And if that means that we're subsidizing insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and whatever, and that has a trickle-down benefit to the people who actually have more healthcare coverage, that's a way that you can incrementally improve what is a tragically fundamentally corrupt system, which is dysfunctional. And so that's what Obama did. He's like, we're going to tinker a tiny bit and we're going to co-opt Mitt Romney's plan. We're going to make that the Democrats' plan. And then he goes on to dump on Medicare for all. And he says the need to replace private insurance and for-profit healthcare with a single-payer system like Canada's was an article of faith for like the people that are pushing. So it's just like an article of faith. Like he's already acknowledged that we have the most inefficient system in the world, but this is an article of faith. And then he says he agrees with it. And so he like it's an article of faith that he agrees with. So he's like, there are good reasons to believe in this article of faith. Well, if you have reasons for it, it's not an article of faith. But okay, whatever. Again, he's just trying to dump and dismiss this idea while getting credit for supporting it. He wants to get credit for everything that he didn't do, as well as all the terrible things that he did do, which the terrible people that support him give him credit for already. So he wants support from the bad people for the bad things that he did, and from the good people for the good things that he wanted to do but didn't do. He says, had we been starting from scratch, I would have agreed with them on their article of faith. He didn't say that. The evidence from other countries showed that a single national system, basically Medicare for all, was a cost-effective way to deliver quality health care. Surprise, surprise. Another reason our system's so inefficient is because there's 100 different insurers, and there's, some operate in this state and that state, and they all have different plans, and they all have different deductibles and copays. And so the administration of our system, it's like a fifth of the cost goes towards administrative paperwork. If it's just one system that everybody has, that bloat goes way, way down. And so it's just there's 100 different reasons why single payer is better, and Obama realizes them, but then he goes on to dump on him. But neither Massachusetts nor the United States was starting from scratch. Oh, unlike these other countries, did you know that in Canada, before there was just a bunch of naked people in the Garden of Eden, and they, from scratch they decided what type of healthcare system they want to do. No, nothing starts from scratch ever. You obviously start with what you were given with before, but the thing that is a variable which determines how successful it's going to be is whether political leaders are actually willing to push and take on what was the entrenched interest from prior for the benefit of the population, or if they're not. But Obama's going to be like, I wanted to, but I couldn't take on these people that I'm now working with to write my own bill. No, you can't do that if you go with the assumption that you have to accommodate those people. Ted Kennedy, who despite his reputation as a wide-eyed liberal was ever practical, understood that trying to dismantle the existing system and replace it with an entirely new one would be not only a political non-starter, but hugely disruptive economically. And so it's like, we don't want anything to be, first of all, it's politically a non-starter, and so we have to think about our politics, and it's going to be disruptive economically, and so we can't disrupt the economy. Like, if the economy, it's flowing perfectly right now as people go bankrupt constantly for not being able to afford their health insurance, and they die prematurely because they're cutting their pills in half, or they aren't going to the doctors when they're sick because they're worried about their high copay or deductibles or the lack of insurance, and then when they do go, the cancer has reached stage 4 and they're not able to be helped. That's one of the major reasons our costs are so high, is because a lot of people will go to emergency rooms when they should have been in the hospital months prior, and they could have dealt with the situation earlier than that, but they don't, because they don't have health care. If it was universal and people were getting checkups when they needed them, then those extremely high costs of the emergency room would be much diminished. But it's like, again, it's working just right for the right people. So it's the most dysfunctional system, but it's not disruptive in the sense that the money keeps flowing towards the shareholders. But it might be disruptive for the shareholders and the economy if people start getting good. Like, it wouldn't be disruptive to people who have health care. It would be disruptive to the special interests that Obama's accommodated himself to. And so he says, instead, he'd embrace the Romney proposal with enthusiasm and help the governor line up the Democratic votes in the state legislature required to pass a law. And so it's like, okay, Mitt Romney, the Heritage Foundation, that's as far as we can go in America, because everybody agrees that we can't challenge the system as it is, and so the best we can do is tinker with it with a right-wing plan, Romney Care, as it eventually became known. 10 pages after, Obama goes out of his way to twist himself into pretzels to say why he has to accommodate the right-wing healthcare plan and the insurance companies and special interests, because you can't take them on, and he doesn't want to, do anything with the movement. Now comes the Tea Party, and, he has a grudging respect for how rapidly Tea Party leaders had mobilized a strong following and managed to dominate the news coverage using some of the same social media and grassroots organizing strategies we deployed during my own campaign. And so here is the Tea Party, which is kind of a weird movement, but is a grassroots movement in many respects that is changing the conversation and pushing right-wing agendas into the forefront. Like, look at their party, Republican Party right now in the Freedom Caucus, and compare that to the Republican Party of the 1990s. The reason for it is because the Tea Party and its predecessors and its successors with the Trump campaign have gone so far off the rails that it's pushing things that are totally insane into the mainstream. And so that same energy could have been used for things that were actually popular and helpful, by the movement candidate, the change candidate, to get things like health insurance, but instead he co-opted himself to the special interests, which people like the Tea Party, like Tea Partiers, they're not fans of getting ripped off by insurance companies either. And I think even 47% of Republicans still support single-payer health care, despite nobody advocating for it. But when the left wing goes out of its way to shoot its own base in the face, then those dark forces from right-wing populism will take over, shift the spectrum to the right, and then become the thorn in the side of Obama that he starts complaining about now, while in reality, the reason that that energy is there is because Obama failed to use his own leverage to fight for people when he had the chance. And then Obama starts talking about the public option on page 414. So he says, from the very start of the healthcare debates, policy wonks on the left had pushed us to modify the Massachusetts model by giving consumers the choice to buy coverage on the online exchange, not just from the likes of Athena and Blue Cross Blue Shield, but also from a newly formed insurer owned and operated by the government. Unsurprisingly, insurance companies had balked at the idea of a public option, arguing that they would not be able to compete against a government insurance plan that could operate without the pressures of making a profit. Let me read that again. Balked at the idea of a public option, arguing that they would not be able to compete against a government insurance plan that could operate without the pressures of making a profit. And so the insurance companies know that this public option, like if the government was to come into healthcare and didn't have to make billions of dollars for their shareholders by ripping people off, they would not be able to compete with that. So the special interests go out of the way to squash that deal. And he goes on and he says, of course, for the public option proponents, unlike Obama, who's not one, that was exactly the point. By highlighting the cost-effectiveness of government insurance and exposing the bloated weight and immorality of the private insurance market, they hoped the public option would pave the way for a single-payer system. Yeah, okay, so what is the problem here? It was a clever idea, and one that had enough traction that Nancy Pelosi had included it in the House bill. But on the Senate side, we were no closer to having 60 votes. So we didn't have the votes for it. Like, again, we didn't have the votes. Like, we have to work with the insurance companies to go out of the way to squash anything that would give the American people a more efficient system that would threaten their profits. So we don't have the votes for that. We're never going to have the votes for it. Like, if the system, if nothing fundamentally changes, we are never going to have the votes for anything, because the system is run by the special interests, which are currently in power, and it's run to their benefit. And unless they're challenged, it's going to continue to be run by them. And so in 4 years, in 8 years, and 10 years, they're going to continue to make more money. They're going to continue to have more lobbyists and donate to more political campaigns. And you're not going to have the votes then either. In fact, like right now, we just finished 4 years of Trump, and we're crossing our fingers that maybe you'll get to 50 votes again. You had 60 votes here. Like, do you think it's more likely that we're going to get it now with 50? I think in 2 years we'll probably have like 46 votes. Like, it keeps going down as American people lose faith in institutions, as their progressive politicians that are promising hope and change decide to sell out to the very insurance companies which are going out of the way to block the reforms that these same politicians, namely Obama, promised during the campaign trail. And so again, he goes out of the way. Yeah, no public option. He's like, we can't have it. I want my team, and I thought a possible compromise might involve offering a public option only in those parts of the country that were blah, blah, blah. But even that was too much for the more conservative members of the Democratic caucus to swallow, including Joe Liberman of Connecticut, who endorsed John McCain. He's like, okay, we have Joe Lieberman. Like, I know I have the entire American people, the presidency. I'm the head of my party, the biggest majority ever. But look, one of them is Joe Liberman. And so I have to go out of my way to accommodate Joe Liberman and the insurance industry to block a public option, which isn't even as good as the other countries have with their single-payer systems. And so that's not even a partial public option is impossible, because, like, you can't overcome the political, behemoth that is Joe Liberman. It's like, politicians are supposed to move to the will of the people if there actually is genuine force for a movement, if you do want to change things. And Obama's like, look, I understand all the people and the ripped off, millions of people dying, uninsured, blah, blah, blah. Joe Lieberman over here, got to work with Joe and the insurance companies. And so Obama blocks everything that could actually fundamentally help the healthcare system, whether it's single payer or a public option or even a partial public option. And then then holds the pity party for himself, which he holds every 50 pages or so, it seems. When the word got out that the public opinion had been removed, the public option had been removed from the Senate bill, activists on the left went ballistic. These are rational activists going ballistics. I found the brouhaha exasperating. What is it about 60 votes that these people don't understand? These people don't understand politics. Like, yeah, these people don't understand politics. Like, sorry, women's suffrage activists of 1910, don't you see that we don't have the votes here? Why are you always complaining about that? We couldn't get you the right to vote, but instead we were able to, work with the Joe Liberman of 1910 to get you all nice decorative hats and to, allow for like the rule of thumb. There used to be a rule of thumb that you couldn't beat your wife with a stick that was larger than your thumb. We've got that reduced to a rule of the index finger, and this is going to tangibly affect your lives. We don't have the votes to get you the right to vote, but we have actually made a difference in your lives. No, actually what you're supposed to do is go out and get the votes by using public opinion, which is already there, to make a difference for them. Part 4 of the book, The Good Fight, is coming to an end, and it's going to be succeeded by Part 5, which is The World as It Is. And so this is not just the end of the chapter, but the end of a whole part, one of the 8 parts of the book. And so this is going to be exceedingly sappy, and Obama's got to kind of connect the good fight, which is the idealistic version of Obama, with the next chapter or the next part, which is the world as it is. So the bridge between the idealist, the young idealist, trying to do everything that he can, and the pragmatic president trying to help people in the real world, dealing with the world as it is. That bridge is going to be gapped, and this paragraph just does it perfectly. And so he says, it's not hard to find people who hate Congress, voters who are convinced that Capitol Hill is filled with posers and cowards, that most of their elected officials are in the pockets of lobbyists and big donors and motivated by a hunger for power. When I hear such criticism, I usually nod and acknowledge that there are some who live up to these stereotypes. I admit that watching the daily scrum that takes place on the House and Senate floor can sap even the hardiest spirit. But I also tell people about Tom Perello's words. Tom Perello talked about how he's going to vote for the healthcare bill despite maybe losing his job for it. To me, before the healthcare vote, I described what he and many others did so soon after they'd first been elected, how many of us are tested in that way, are asked to risk careers we've long dreamed of in service of some greater good. To those people those people can be found in Washington. That is politics too. And so, the nihilism and the, just the constant pessimism about the motivations of our politicians are sometimes aided by the scant outsider, the exception. But in general, that is politics too. Civil servants trying best to help the people.